Hello, historians. Welcome back. We're going to continue discussing the Vietnam War. Remember, at the very beginning of this war, it was extremely popular. Over 80% of the people believed, yes, we should be going to war to stop the spread of communism. Even if they didn't really know exactly what was going on, yep, this is what we do. We're the good guys, and anybody that we might be fighting is the bad guys. And so at the beginning, very popular war. However, after we're involved for a few years, people decide, you know what, maybe this isn't a good war. And so you're going to start to see some backlash. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go here. You'll see some very iconic photographs. You got one here where they're kind of sticking the flower, the hippies sticking the flower in the gun. So first, let's talk about your average Americans. How are they learning about the war in the late 1960s? Well, first of all, it is the first televised war experienced by families as they gathered around the TV each evening. They were able to kind of see news clips from the Vietnam War. You have people that are over there, reporters over there. And so this becomes the first war that people are able to watch on their television set. Before this, it was all coming from radio. It might be coming at the movies when they had little news clips when you go sit down in a theater. it You were reading about it in newspapers. Now it is coming into your living room. There were also photographers and cameramen delivering these horrifying images of war. We already saw the protest by the Buddhist monks. You know, you've got these images of the soldiers walking through the rice paddies. This was from the Tet Offensive. We saw this on the last PowerPoint. My Lai, we kind of ended with that, and this was that when this happens and it comes out in the 70s, and people start reading about the cover-up, this really starts to turn people against the war. Um, there were other massacres, but this was by far the worst. American soldiers were ordered to kill civilians. So it wasn't like it was an accident where they thought it was bad guys in an area and they were going after them, or they thought it was the Viet Cong. Basically, this was just okay, these people have been helping the Viet Cong, take them out. And soldiers followed orders. And when this was uncovered a few years later, it was a big scandal, obviously. That's not what we're supposed to be doing there, is, massacring women, children, and the elderly. Lieutenant William Calley Jr. Was one who ordered the attack. We'll see a little video on it later. Also, people are learning about this stuff, including what happened at My Lai, from the soldiers that are returning home, and many of them are coming home and they're not being welcomed home like we saw during World War II. And a lot of them are coming home and they're telling people, hey, this isn't a good war. We don't even know what we're doing over there. And so you didn't have all the soldiers returning home. You had some that returned home and said this. Local newspapers relayed information. So think of the 1960s, maybe the New Prague Times gets a letter from a soldier, or a family gives it to the New Prague Times to print. And sometimes those letters, they describe the terrible battles that they were having over there, senseless killing, confusion, frustration. So it's certainly a different feeling than, okay, Hitler's taking over Europe, we're going to go and stop him during World War II. Now, what you have is, okay, we're in this country, and it seems like the people don't even want us there. And you might, if you've watched a couple of those segments now on the soldiers' letters home that we've watched, you might kind of be getting that feeling a little bit. And, Americans just felt like they're not really getting the answers. They keep hearing we're winning, but they don't really get the answers, and they're not, there's nothing to show for it. It's not like Europe where, okay, France is now liberated, Belgium's now liberated, where in World War II, you could see that we were winning. Here, you just had to take the government's word for it. Now, people were out protesting throughout the mid to late 1960s. One of the terms that's brought up at this point is the silent majority, a large group of people who are not outspoken but support the government. Nixon actually uses it in a speech in 1969, but for the most part, people had mentioned this before. Yeah, you have your protesters, they're the loud ones, but the people that aren't protesting are for the war, basically, is what the silent majority meant. 1962, the Selective Service or draft was implemented by the government. Bob Dylan, that same year in 1962, writes Blowing in the Wind, and he says, hey, this song is not a protest song, but it's been used as a protest song many times. It just questions things. It has rhetorical questions about peace, war, and freedom in it. And so throughout history, for the last 50 years, people have used this song as a protest song for anything. Bob Dylan always said, hey, I just sang. Early protests, the anti-war movement began on college campuses. That's where it really started. They had these things called teach-ins where people showed up and taught about what was going on in Vietnam. They taught maybe some philosophy of why they thought it was wrong. And that's how college kids began to learn about this stuff. So it really starts there and spreads outside. The first teach-in occurred at the University of Michigan, and they were holding the most teach-ins. Over 3,000 students and faculty were going to meet. They participated in lectures, debates, and just discussion about our involvement in the war. And so this spreads around the country, and pretty much probably every major college and even small colleges had these teach-ins. Because otherwise, how were you going to learn about Vietnam War? From World War II on, men between ages of 18 and 25 were issued draft cards, and they had to carry these at all times. Nowadays, you don't get a draft card, but you do register for the draft on the internet. Hopefully, we never have to use the draft again. And as a symbol of protest, what you started to see was people were burning their draft cards starting in 1965. And this started at the University of California, Berkeley. You can see these guys burning their draft cards. You can be arrested for burning your draft card. You can be fined. You can spend time in jail. Now, there were people that decided, hey, if I get drafted, I'm not going. They called these people draft dodgers. And that would have been a derogatory term. It still might be brought up sometimes in presidential elections. I think I saw a stat like you look at the last so many presidents that were eligible that were in that age where they could have been drafted for Vietnam or candidates for presidency that could have been drafted, and like a huge percentage of them over the years found ways out of the draft, either by joining the National Guard and being stationed somewhere else or whatever it is. From going back to candidates in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2000 teens, 2020 now. And that just, we'll see a protest song by CCR, Fortunate Son, was kind of singing about this, that, hey, all these rich guys are able to kind of get out of the draft and not really face any penalties. He sings about, I wasn't born with a silver spoon or all that stuff. So wasn't a senator's son. Now, regular people, well, they couldn't, they had trouble getting out of the draft. And so sometimes they would be arrested. They would flee to Canada, that type of stuff. The protest groups, starting around 1966, started marching. So it's leaving the college campuses, it's going into other places. They were having marches against the war, against the draft, napalm that burned the forest. That as they saw effects from that, and people would civilians with these burns on them, they started protesting that as well. Vietnam War veterans, by 1966, you start seeing vets come home. They're done with the war. They've done their tour in Vietnam, and they start to protest as well. And this is probably even more damaging than the college students protesting, because you're looking at people that were actually there fighting. Now, by 1967, casualties that had occurred, we had over 15,000 soldiers that were killed and over 109,000 soldiers that had been wounded over there. We were spending about $25 billion a year on the war. People weren't seeing the results. And we had close to 500,000 troops over in Vietnam. And about 40,000 young men were being drafted per year. One of the most famous people in the country at the time was Muhammad Ali. He was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world. He's definitely a guy, when you hear his name today, even if you're not a sports fan, you don't know anything about boxing, most people know who Muhammad Ali is. And he refused to join the war when he got drafted. And his famous line was, "I ain't got no quarrel with the Viet Cong," meaning they haven't done anything to me. Basically, he said, it's not fair how African Americans are being treated in the United States. Why would I go fight for a country that doesn't treat African Americans equally? And we'll see a link on that as well later. But he was stripped of his title, and so he was not allowed to box, and he was jailed. And for a long time, there was kind of some, maybe dislike towards Muhammad Ali. He'll end up fighting again after this. He'll end up winning the championship back in the 70s. This was I believe this was 1996 in Atlanta, Georgia at the Olympics, and Muhammad Ali lit the Olympic torch, and people were cheering, and it was kind of like, all was forgiven over the years after this. What we start to see is a wide variety of people starting to protest this war. Famous singers like John Lennon, Martin Luther King Jr. was against the war and was protesting it shortly before he's assassinated. Jane Fonda, actually a famous actress, took a trip to North Vietnam, which would have been very controversial. That would be similar to think of an actress taking a trip to a Al Qaeda or an ISIS camp and saying how these people are being mistreated. A little bit different scenario, of course, ISIS and Al Qaeda in North Vietnam. So it's different, but that was kind of the feeling at the time. Why is she hanging out with the enemy? We continue to see more protests, big protests at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. I think that's the one where, if you watch Forrest Gump, he's given a speech there. A lot of songs in the 60s and 70s, early 70s, being written about anti-Vietnam War. I'll have a link to some protest songs that you can listen to. In the end, Lyndon Johnson basically says he feels he lost America after this happened. So Walter Cronkite was a very prestigious news anchor on television. And he basically says in 1968 that, the war in Vietnam is wrong and we need to bring the soldiers home. And he says that in 1968. And Johnson says basically to his staff, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. And this is after the Tet Offensive. This is when, it just doesn't seem like we have a very good plan. Famous photograph at the White House. Here's LBJ. And he decides, you know what, I am not going to run for a second term. The Tet Offensive showed people that this war was far from being over. And so LBJ says, I'm not going to run, which is huge news. In the 1968 election, Richard Nixon, a former vice president for Eisenhower, wins the presidency. He defeats Hubert H. Humphrey. Humphrey was a senator from Minnesota, He was also the vice president for LBJ. And Humphrey, probably what costs him the election is he refused to denounce the Vietnam War. He refused to say we were losing. He refused to say that it was bad. He just kept supporting LBJ. And had he not supported LBJ and had he said, "Yep, what we're doing is wrong," then there's a good chance he would have beat Nixon out. However, he does not, and the Vietnam War pretty much costs Humphrey the presidency. Minnesota has never had a president, just 2 vice presidents. So there's Nixon, not the peace sign, the victory sign, V for victory.